It wasn't the first time Sandra had stared at her phone in the middle of the night, wondering if reaching out would be too much. But this particular evening, sitting in her kitchen with the house silent around her and her thoughts running in circles she couldn't escape, she found herself scrolling to Keanu's name before she could talk herself out of it. The clock read 2:17 a.m. She'd been sitting there for almost 2 hours, having come downstairs for water and then never making it back to bed. The kitchen had that particular quality of silence that only exists in the deep hours of night, when even the ambient sounds of a house settling seemed to pause. Her tea had gone cold an hour ago. She'd reheated it once, then let it go cold again, distracted by the spiral of thoughts that had driven her from sleep in the first place. She hesitated with her thumb over the call button, aware of how this might look. They hadn't worked together in years. Their friendship had settled into that comfortable pattern of occasional texts, industry event hellos, and genuine warmth that didn't require constant maintenance. But right now, in this specific moment of her life, he was the person who came to mind. Not because he would have answers, but because she knew he wouldn't pretend to. There was something about Keanu that had always felt different. Even on the speed set, when they were both younger and the machinery of fame worked differently, he'd had this quality of being fully present without performing presence. She remembered moments between takes when they'd sit in companionable silence, and it never felt like he was waiting for her to be interesting or funny or on. He just seemed comfortable with whatever was. She pressed call. He answered on the third ring, his voice alert but not startled, as if being awake at this hour was nothing unusual for him. "Hey," he said simply. No surprise, no concern bleeding into the greeting, just presence. "I woke you up," Sandra said, though his tone suggested she probably hadn't. "No, you didn't." There was a pause where she could hear him moving, maybe stepping outside or into another room. A door closed softly in the background. "What's going on?" The question wasn't pointed. It didn't carry the weight of alarm or the presumption that something must be terribly wrong for her to call at this hour. It was just an opening, an invitation she could accept or decline. Sandra found herself laughing, a small sound that acknowledged the absurdity of the situation. "I don't actually know why I called. I've been sitting here thinking about things that don't matter and things that do, and I couldn't tell which was which anymore." "Yeah," Keanu said. The single word carried understanding. He didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. She appreciated that more than she could articulate. In their industry, in their lives, people always wanted to fix or solve or advise. The quiet he offered wasn't empty. It was space being held open. Sandra traced the rim of her cold tea with one finger, gathering her thoughts. "Do you ever feel like you've spent so much time being the person everyone expects that you've forgotten which parts of you were real to begin with?" The question came out before she could polish it, raw in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. Keanu was quiet for a moment, and Sandra could picture him considering the question with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. She heard what might have been wind in the background, and she imagined him on his porch or maybe in his yard, looking up at the same night sky she could see through her kitchen window. "Every day," he finally said, "not in a way that feels dramatic, just in these small moments where I catch myself performing something that used to be genuine, and I can't remember when the switch happened." She closed her eyes, relief washing over her at the honesty. "I did 3 interviews yesterday, 3 different versions of the same conversation about gratitude and growth and finding balance. And I meant it, all of it, but by the third one I heard myself laughing at a question the exact same way I'd laughed the first time, and I realized I'd turned my sincerity into a routine." "The laugh works though," Keanu said, and she could hear the slight smile in his voice. "That's the problem. It all works. The stories work, the insights work. The version of myself I present works so well that sometimes I can't find my way back to the person who isn't performing anything." She hadn't meant to say all of that, but it was 2 a.m. and he'd answered the phone, and something about his voice made it feel safe to acknowledge the things she usually kept locked away. There was no judgment in his silence, no rush to reassure her that she was being too hard on herself. He was just listening, really listening, in a way that felt increasingly rare. "I think that's why I keep doing the motorcycle thing," Keanu said after a pause. Not because it's therapeutic or whatever people think, but because when you're on a bike, you can't be performing. You're just trying not to die in the most meditative way possible. Sandra laughed for real this time, the sound surprising her with its genuine quality. Is that your solution? I should get a motorcycle. God, no, you'd be terrible at it. Excuse me. You'd turn it into something you had to be good at. 3 weeks in, you'd be taking advanced courses and researching optimal gear and trying to optimize the whole experience. His tone was warm, teasing in the way only real friends could manage. You'd miss the entire point by being too good at it. He wasn't wrong. Sandra felt the truth of it settling in her chest. She'd always been that way, approaching everything with a determination to master it. Even motherhood, which resisted mastery by its very nature, she'd attacked with the same energy she brought to preparing for roles. Reading every book, consulting every expert, trying to find the perfect balance of structure and spontaneity. So what do I do? What's my version? She asked. I don't know, Keanu said, but I don't think you called me because you wanted an answer. I think you called because you needed someone who wouldn't try to give you one. She sat with that, watching the shadows in her kitchen, feeling something unknot inside her. When did you get wise? I'm not wise, I'm just tired enough to be honest. What are you tired of? The question seemed to catch him off guard. She heard him breathe out slowly, considering. The pause stretched long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped, pushed into territory that even their late-night honesty couldn't quite reach. The distance, he finally said, between who I am and who people need me to be. It's not that either version is false, exactly. But maintaining both and the space between them, it's exhausting in a way I don't think I knew how to name until right now. Sandra understood exactly what he meant. They existed in a strange bubble, their lives simultaneously completely normal and utterly surreal. They both did regular things, felt regular feelings, struggled with regular doubts. But they did it all while carrying these public identities that had been shaped by millions of people's projections and expectations. She thought about the woman who'd approached her at the farmer's market last week. Sweet, genuine, clearly nervous. She told Sandra that watching her movies had helped her through her divorce, that seeing a strong woman on screen had given her the courage to leave a bad situation. And Sandra had been moved, truly moved. But even as she'd thanked the woman and listened to her story, part of her brain had been calculating timing, aware of her children waiting in the car, conscious of other people starting to notice, managing the interaction with practiced grace even as she genuinely cared. Do you remember that day on the speed set when we spent like 2 hours just sitting in your trailer talking about nothing? She asked. When you made me explain my entire childhood obsession with hockey. You were so earnest about it, that's what I remember. You weren't trying to be charming or interesting. You were just telling me about this thing you'd loved as a kid, and your face completely changed when you talked about it. You got this look like you were 12 again, explaining why the Maple Leafs were going to win the cup. They didn't, Keanu said dryly. No, but you believed they would. That's the thing. You weren't performing nostalgia or doing that thing people do where they talk about childhood to seem relatable. You were just actually there in the memory, feeling it all over again. I still love hockey, Keanu said quietly. I know, but that version of you, the one who got lost in talking about something simple just because it mattered to you, do you still have access to that? The question hung between them. Sandra wasn't sure if she was asking him or herself. She tried to remember the last time she'd talked about something with that kind of unself-conscious passion, without some part of her brain monitoring how she sounded, whether she was being too much or not enough. Sometimes, he said, usually when no one's watching, or with people who knew me before all this. My sister can still pull that version out of me. She'll say something that throws me back to being 12 and suddenly I'm not performing anything. I'm just her annoying brother again. What does she say? Anything, really? Last week she texted me asking if I remembered the time I convinced myself I could train our dog to fetch the newspaper like in the movies, and I ended up spending 2 months trying before finally admitting defeat. Just that one text, and suddenly I was right back there, feeling that specific combination of determination and growing awareness that I'd completely overestimated my animal training abilities. Sandra smiled, imagining a young Keanu stubbornly working with an indifferent dog. What happened to the dog? She lived a long, happy life completely uninterested in fetching newspapers. I think the most I ever got was her picking one up and then immediately dropping it to chase a squirrel. But you kept trying for 2 months. I was an optimistic kid, stubborn but optimistic. I miss that, Sandra said. Having people who know you before you knew how to curate yourself. People who remember when you were just a person trying things and failing at them without it meaning anything about your worth or your identity. You have that though, Keanu said. You've kept those people in your life. I remember you talking about your friends from before, the ones who still treat you like you're just Sandy who talks too much when she's nervous. She had to smile at that. He'd remembered something she'd mentioned years ago, a small detail about her old nickname and her tendency to fill silence with chatter when she was anxious. I have, but I've also spent 25 years training myself to be on, so automatically that sometimes I do it with them too. Like I can't quite remember how to just be without managing the experience of being me. Yeah, Keanu said, and she could hear the recognition in his voice. The worst is when you catch yourself doing it alone. Like, who are you performing for? But you can't stop because you've forgotten what the alternative feels like. They fell into silence again, but it felt different now. Shared. Sandra realized this was the first conversation she'd had in months where she wasn't tracking how she sounded, wasn't editing herself in real time. Somehow at 2:30 in the morning, talking to someone she'd worked with years ago but maintained this strange thread of connection with, she'd stumbled into authenticity by accident. The kitchen had started to feel less like a place of insomnia and more like a refuge. She pulled her knees up to her chest, settling more comfortably in the chair. Outside, she could hear the first tentative sounds of early birds, the world beginning its slow turn toward morning. "Can I tell you something?" Keanu asked. "Please." "I don't think the performing version and the real version are as separate as we think they are. I think we've just spent so long believing they have to be different that we've created a gap where maybe there doesn't need to be one." Sandra considered this, testing it against her experience. It felt both comforting and unsettling, like most truths that challenged her understanding of herself. Keep going. Like the gratitude you talked about in those interviews, that's real. You've just said it enough times that you've found the most effective way to express it. That doesn't make it false. It makes it refined. And yeah, maybe the laugh is a little automatic now, but it came from somewhere genuine once. You're not losing yourself. You're just experiencing the weird thing that happens when you have to translate your private self into public language over and over until the translation becomes its own thing. So you're saying I'm not having an existential crisis. I'm just overthinking the fact that I've gotten good at communicating. I'm saying maybe both can be true. You can be genuinely lost and also just tired of the performance required to be found. Sandra let that settle over her. There was something in it that felt true, though she wasn't sure if it made her feel better or just differently confused. "When did you think about this?" she asked. "About 15 years ago, after I did this press tour where I kept telling the same story about my dog, and by the end I realized I'd started telling it the way people wanted to hear it instead of the way it actually happened. It sent me into this spiral of thinking I'd lost touch with reality. But then I went home and my dog was still there, and I still loved her the same way I always had. The story had changed, but the feeling hadn't. I was still me. I just learned how to package myself." "That's either really comforting or really depressing," Sandra said. "Both, always both. That's what I've learned. Almost everything about this life is both the best and worst thing simultaneously. The recognition that lets you make meaningful work also means you can't move through the world invisibly. The platform that lets you bring attention to things that matter also turns your every opinion into a headline. The success that gives you choices also creates pressure to choose correctly." Sandra nodded, though he couldn't see her. "And the friendships that form in this weird bubble are both completely genuine and also shaped by the fact that you're two people who understand a reality most people can't imagine." "Exactly, like you and I are really friends, but we're also friends because we met in a context where we were both becoming versions of ourselves that needed each other's understanding. Does that make the friendship less real? I don't think so, but it's complicated. Everything's complicated, Sandra said. I keep waiting for the moment when it gets simple, when I'll have been doing this long enough to just relax into it, but it hasn't happened yet. I don't think it does happen. I think we just get better at being comfortable with the complication. She considered this, watching the sky continue its subtle shift toward dawn. Is that enough, though, to just acknowledge it? I don't know. Maybe some nights it has to be. The honesty in his answer felt like a gift. Not a solution, not reassurance, just acknowledgement that some questions didn't have satisfying answers. They talked for a while longer, the conversation drifting but maintaining the same thread of honesty. Keanu told her about a stranger who'd recognized him at a hardware store and then, instead of asking for a photo, had simply nodded and said, "Hope you find what you're looking for," which had struck him as the most perfect interaction possible. The stranger had seen him, acknowledged him, and then let him be, all in the span of a moment. Sandra told him about her son asking her why people at the grocery store stared at them, and trying to find an age-appropriate way to explain celebrity to someone who just wanted to understand why normal errands felt different for them than for other families. She'd ended up talking about how sometimes people recognize faces from movies the way they might recognize a favorite character from a book, and her son had accepted this explanation with the easy flexibility of childhood. The other day he asked me why I was sad, she said, and I wasn't even aware that I was showing it. I thought I was fine, that I'd compartmentalized whatever I was feeling. But he saw it anyway, and I had this moment of panic about what the right answer was. Do I protect him from my emotions? Do I model healthy expression of feelings? What did you tell him? Keanu asked. I told him I was just tired and thinking about a lot of things, which was true, but also felt like a cop-out. And then I felt guilty about that, which added another layer to the whole thing. Parenting seems impossibly hard, Keanu said quietly. It is, but it's also the most grounding thing I've ever done. Like when I'm with them, I can't afford to be too far in my head. They need me present, and that cuts through a lot of the noise. They're lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have them, even when I'm exhausted and confused and wondering if I'm screwing them up with my neuroses. You're not screwing them up, Keanu said with such certainty that Sandra felt something loosen in her chest. How can you know that? Because you're asking the question, because you care enough to worry, because from everything you've ever told me about them, they're loved and seen and given room to be themselves. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes, the kind that come from being seen and reassured in a moment when you didn't even realize how much you needed it. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For answering the phone, for not making this weird. For just being exactly who you are, which is somehow exactly who I needed to talk to right now. Right back at you, Keanu said. Seriously, I've been awake since midnight just rattling around in my own thoughts. This has been better than any alternative I was going to come up with on my own. When they finally said goodnight, the sky was starting to lighten properly. Sandra felt the particular tiredness that comes from honesty, the kind that makes sleep feel earned rather than escaped into. Thank you for calling, Keanu said. I mean that. Sometimes you need a reminder that other people are awake in the same weird hours, thinking the same weird thoughts. After they hung up, Sandra sat for a while longer in her kitchen, watching dawn break through the windows. She didn't feel transformed or resolved. She felt exactly like herself, tired and uncertain and grateful, without needing to perform any of those feelings for anyone. The conversation would never become an anecdote. Neither of them would tell the story at dinner parties or mention it in interviews. It would just exist as this small moment of mutual recognition. Two people acknowledging that the gap between public and private selves wasn't a failure of authenticity, but maybe just the cost of being seen. She went to bed as the house began to wake up around her, carrying with her the quiet comfort of being known without being solved, understood without being fixed. In a life full of performance and precision, There was something irreplaceable about a friend who could hold space for confusion at 2 a.m. without trying to turn it into anything more than what it was. Just two people, awake at the wrong hours, remembering together that being human didn't require having it all figured out. Sometimes it just required someone answering the phone.